The bridge of the luminous dawn was filled with quiet panic, as Captain Lyron Thoss watched another colony disappear from their communication grid. His delicate three-fingered hands gripped the command console as he tried to steady his breathing. The Velkhari had never known true war in their 3,000 years of civilization. They were a species of artists and scholars who believed that violence was the mark of primitive minds. Their ships were beautiful things of curved metal and glowing energy fields designed more for elegance than combat. Their weapons were minimal because they had never needed them. The galaxy they knew was peaceful and orderly. Every species followed the rules set by the Galactic Council, and disputes were settled through discussion and compromise. But the Krathok swarm did not care about rules or discussion. They were a hive mind that consumed everything in their path. They turned living worlds into dead rock stripped of all biological matter. They had appeared at the edge of Velkhari space 3 months ago, and since then they had destroyed 7 colonies. The Velkhari defense forces had tried to stop them, but it was like throwing flowers at a storm. Their ceremonial ships and inexperienced crews were swept aside in hours. Millions of Velkhari had died, and millions more would follow if something did not change. Lyron looked at his communications officer. She was young, and her large eyes were wet with tears that she was trying to hold back. Her name was Saria, and she had family on one of the colonies that had just gone silent. He wanted to comfort her, but he had no comfort to give. He was the captain, and captains were supposed to have answers, but he had none. The Galactic Council had sent messages of sympathy, but no actual help. The nearby species were too far away or too weak to make a difference. The Velkhari were alone against an enemy they could not defeat. There was one option left, but it was unthinkable. It went against everything the Velkhari believed about civilization and safety. But watching his people die was also unthinkable. Lyron made his decision and tried not to think about the consequences. He turned to Saria and spoke in a voice that was steadier than he felt. He told her to open a channel to the quarantine zone. She looked at him with shock and disbelief. The quarantine zone was where the dangerous species lived, the species that the Galactic Council had deemed too violent and too unstable to join civilized society. It had been sealed off for nearly a century, and no one spoke about what was inside except in warnings and cautionary tales. Saria asked if he was certain, and Lyron nodded. He told her to broadcast on all frequencies and to use the emergency military codes. He told her to explain that the Velkhari needed help and that they would pay any price. His officers stared at him like he had lost his mind. Perhaps he had. But madness was better than extinction. The message was crafted carefully. It explained who the Velkhari were and what they faced. It included tactical data about the Krathok swarm and coordinates for Velkhari space. It offered payment in technology and resources and cultural exchange. It begged for military assistance from anyone who could provide it. The message was sent toward a small yellow star that the Velkhari charts labeled as Sector 447 Tertius. The system was at the center of the quarantine zone, and it housed the species that had terrified the galaxy into creating the quarantine in the first place. According to the old records, they called themselves humans, and they came from a planet called Earth. Earth was classified as a Class 12 death world, which meant it was barely habitable even by the standards of hardy species. Its gravity was crushing. Its weather was violent. Its native life was aggressive and dangerous. The humans who evolved, there had become something the galaxy had never seen before. They were strong and fast and adaptable. They healed from injuries that would kill other species. They could survive in environments that would be lethal to most civilized beings. And most terrifying of all, they were incredibly violent. The records showed that humans had spent their entire history fighting each other. They had developed weapons of such devastating power that they had nearly destroyed themselves multiple times. Wars involving hundreds of millions of casualties were common in their history. They had created weapons that could poison entire planets and bombs that could vaporize cities. When the Galactic Council made first contact with them 80 years ago, the humans had been excited and hopeful. They had reached out with friendship and curiosity. But the Council had looked at their history and their biology and made a decision. Humanity was too dangerous to be allowed into the galaxy. They were quarantined in their own solar system with automated defense stations, preventing any ship from leaving. The Council told them it was for everyone's safety, including their own. Lyran knew all of this. Every child in the galaxy learned about the humans as a cautionary tale about what happened when evolution went wrong. But now he was asking those same humans for help. He was inviting the monsters into his home because the alternative was worse. The message traveled through subspace at faster than light speeds. It would reach the human solar system in approximately 6 hours. Then it would be a matter of whether the humans received it and whether they chose to respond. Lyran did not know if they would help. He did not know if they even could help. The quarantine had prevented them from developing advanced spacefaring technology. For all he knew, they were still confined to their own planet, unable to travel beyond their moon. But he had to try. His people were dying, and he had exhausted every other option. If the humans came and they were as violent as the record suggested, then perhaps they could fight the Krathok. And if the humans came and turned out to be a threat to the Velkari as well, then at least his people would die fighting 2 enemies instead of being slowly consumed by one. It was not much of a hope, but it was all he had left. Saria confirmed that the message had been sent, and Lyran ordered the crew to return to their posts. There was nothing to do now but wait and pray to whatever powers might be listening. The bridge fell silent except for the quiet beeping of sensors and the soft hum of the ship's systems. Outside the view screen, the stars looked cold and distant and indifferent to the fate of the Velkari people. Lyran closed his eyes and tried to imagine what would happen if the humans actually came. Admiral Jacob Pierce was reviewing supply reports in his office on Luna Base 7 when the alert came through. He had been in the Terran Defense Coalition for 30 years, and he had spent most of that time preparing for a war that everyone said would never happen. The quarantine had been in place since before he joined the military, and most people had accepted it as permanent. Humanity was trapped in its own solar system, and that was just how things were. But Jacob had never accepted it. He had spent decades building a fleet and training crews and developing weapons because he believed that someday the situation would change. His superiors thought he was paranoid. His colleagues thought he was obsessed. But they let him continue because there was nothing else for the military to do. Lieutenant Sophie Grant rushed into his office without knocking. Her face was flushed and her eyes were wide with excitement or fear or both. She told him they had received a transmission from outside the quarantine zone. Jacob felt his heart skip a beat. In 80 years, no one from the galaxy beyond had contacted humanity, except to reinforce the quarantine. Sophie explained that the message was a distress call from a species called the Velkari, who were being attacked by something called the Krathok swarm. She pulled up the translated message on his desk screen, and Jacob read it carefully. The Velkari were desperate. They were losing a war and they needed military help. They had sent their plea to humanity because they had nowhere else to turn. Jacob read the message 3 times to make sure he understood it correctly. Someone out there needed help and they were asking humans to provide it. After 80 years of isolation and rejection, someone actually wanted humanity to do what it did best. He told Sophie to verify the authenticity of the message and to start analyzing the tactical data that came with it. Then he ordered her to convene an emergency meeting of the Security Council. Within 2 hours, the council was assembled via secure channels. President Margaret Hayes appeared on the main screen from her office in Geneva. She was 70 years old, and she had spent her entire political career dealing with the frustration and anger that came from humanity's forced isolation. Counselor Derek Shaw from Mars looked skeptical as always. Commander Lisa Park from the military division looked eager. The debate began immediately. Derek argued that the message could be a test from the Galactic Council to see if humans would break quarantine. If they responded, they might face even harsher restrictions. Margaret worried about the cost in lives and resources. Lisa argued that this was exactly the opportunity they had been waiting for. A chance to prove that humanity deserved a place in the galaxy. Jacob listened to all of them and then he spoke. He reminded them that humanity had been preparing for this moment, whether they admitted it or not. The fleet existed. The weapons existed. The trained personnel existed. All of it had been built on the hope that someday humanity would have a chance to show the galaxy who they really were. He told them that the Velkari were facing extinction and that humanity had the power to prevent it. He asked them what kind of species they wanted to be. Did they want to be the monsters that the galaxy feared, or did they want to be the heroes that the galaxy needed? The vote was not immediate. There was more discussion and more debate and more worrying about consequences. But eventually the decision was made. Humanity would answer the distress call. They would break the quarantine and deploy the fleet and help the Valkyrie fight their war. And whatever happened after that would happen. Jacob immediately began issuing orders. The fleet was to assemble at the edge of the solar system near the orbit of Neptune. Every available combat ship was to be made ready for deployment. Crews were recalled from leave and supplies were loaded and weapons were armed. The Terran Defense Coalition had 12 Dreadnought-class warships. Each one was a massive block of armor and guns that could deliver devastating firepower. They had 40 destroyer-class ships that were faster and more maneuverable. They had over 100 frigate-class ships for support and screening. And they had thousands of fighter craft that could operate in conditions that would kill most organic pilots. The flagship was the TDS Valiant, and it would be commanded by Captain Amy Chen. She was 42 years old and she had never seen real combat, but she had trained for it her entire career. Jacob spoke with her privately before the deployment. He told her that she was about to make history. She was going to lead humanity's first military action beyond the solar system. The galaxy would judge humanity based on what she did and how she did it. Amy understood the weight of that responsibility. She told Jacob that she would not let humanity down. The fleet assembled over the course of 18 hours. Ships arrived from all over the solar system. The dockyards of Mars sent their newest destroyers. The orbital platforms around Earth contributed frigates and support vessels. The belt stations provided resource ships and repair craft. It was the largest military mobilization in human history, and it was happening in response to a cry for help from a species that most humans had never heard of. The crews were nervous but determined. They knew they were breaking an 80-year-old quarantine. They knew they might start an interstellar incident, but they also knew they were doing the right thing. Jacob watched the fleet form up on the tactical displays. It was beautiful in a brutal kind of way. Human ships were not elegant like the vessels other species built. They were thick slabs of armor with weapons bolted onto every available surface. They were designed to take punishment and keep fighting. They were designed by a species that came from a world where everything was trying to kill you. Amy sent a message to all ships. She told her fleet that they were about to show the galaxy what humanity could do when they fought for something other than themselves. She told them to be brave and be smart and be the warriors that humanity needed them to be. The jump drives powered up, and space began to bend around the fleet. In 80 years, no human ship had left the solar system. The automated defense stations that enforced the quarantine detected the fleet's movement and sent warnings and threats. But the humans had spent decades studying those stations, and they knew how to avoid triggering an actual attack. The fleet jumped, and for a moment they existed in the strange space between real space and hyperspace. Then they emerged 12 light-years away in Valkyrie space, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The human fleet arrived in Valkyrie space with a flash of energy that lit up every sensor for 1,000 kilometers. Captain Lyran Thos was on the bridge of the luminous dawn when his sensor officer shouted that something had just appeared near the outer colonies. At first, Lyran thought it was more Krathok ships, but the energy signature was completely different. These were not biological vessels. These were metal and machinery and power. The sensor officer counted the ships and his voice shook as he reported the numbers: 57 major combat vessels and hundreds of smaller craft. It was a fleet larger than anything the Valkyrie had ever assembled. Lyran ordered his communications officer to hail the new arrivals. The response came back in heavily accented but understandable Galactic Standard. The voice identified itself as Captain Amy Chen of the Terran Defense Coalition vessel Valiant. She stated that they had received the Valkyrie distress call, and they were here to provide military assistance against the Krathok swarm. Lyran felt relief and terror in equal measure. The humans had actually come. The Deathworlders had broken their quarantine to answer his desperate plea. He opened a channel and welcomed them to Valkyrie space. He tried to keep his voice steady as he thanked them for coming. Amy's response was simple and direct. She told him to transmit all tactical data about the Krathok and to evacuate any civilians from the combat zones. Then she told him to stay out of the way because things were about to get violent. The Krathok swarm detected the human fleet within minutes. Their response was immediate and overwhelming. 300 bioships broke off from their assault on a Valkyrie colony and moved to engage the newcomers. The Krathok had never encountered humans before, but they did not care. They only cared about consuming and spreading. The bioships were massive things that looked like they had been grown rather than built. They had thick organic armor and weapons that fired streams of corrosive material. They moved with frightening speed and coordination because they were all controlled by the same hive mind. Amy watched the Krathok ships approach on her tactical display. Her executive officer, Commander Ryan Torres, asked if they should deploy fighters to screen the fleet. Amy shook her head. She told him to hold the fighters in reserve and to have all ships prepare for direct engagement. Ryan looked uncertain, but he relayed the orders. The Krathok entered weapons range and opened fire. Streams of acid and explosive projectiles crossed the space between the fleets. The Velkhari, watching from a distance, expected to see the human ships take evasive action or raise defensive shields. Instead, the humans did something that made no sense. They flew directly into the Krathok fire. The acid streams splashed against the hulls of the human destroyers and frigates. The explosive projectiles detonated against their armor, and the human ships barely slowed down. The armor plating on Terran vessels was 20 meters thick in places. It was layered composites and reactive materials designed to withstand impacts that would vaporize other ships. The Krathok weapons were devastating against the elegant vessels of the Galactic Council, but against human engineering they were just annoying. Amy waited until the range closed to 10,000 kilometers. Then she gave the order to return fire. The Valiant had 12 railgun batteries along its spine. Each one could accelerate a solid projectile to a significant fraction of light speed. When they fired, the entire ship shuddered from the recoil. The projectiles crossed the distance to the Krathok fleet in less than a second. The first bioship that was hit simply ceased to exist. The kinetic energy was so enormous that the organic armor and the creature inside were converted to superheated plasma. The shockwave from the impact destroyed 2 more ships nearby. Amy ordered continuous fire, and the railguns began their devastating rhythm. Every 3 seconds, another Krathok ship died. The destroyers added their own weapons to the barrage. Missile batteries opened up and hundreds of warheads streaked across space. Each missile carried a fusion warhead because humans had decided that if they were going to fight, they were going to fight with everything they had. The missiles were smart and fast, and they could track evasive targets. The Krathok tried to shoot them down, but human point defense was designed to stop much more sophisticated threats. The missiles reached their targets, and space lit up with dozens of miniature suns. When the light faded, there were holes in the Krathok formation large enough to fly a cruiser through. The Krathok swarm had never experienced anything like this. They had consumed dozens of species and conquered hundreds of worlds. They had always been the strongest and the fastest and the most ruthless, but they had never fought anyone who matched their ruthlessness and exceeded their strength. The hive mind struggled to adapt. It sent more ships into the battle and changed tactics. The bioships began ramming maneuvers because their weapons were not effective. Several Krathok vessels accelerated to maximum speed and threw themselves at human destroyers. The impacts were tremendous. Metal crumpled and armor shattered, and entire sections of the human ships were crushed. But the ships did not explode or break apart. Human engineering included redundant systems and compartmentalized design. A destroyer could lose a third of its mass and still fight. The crews sealed the damaged sections and kept firing. Amy watched her damage reports and made quick decisions. She pulled the most heavily damaged ships back to the second line and rotated fresh vessels into the fight. This was something humans excelled at. Not just violence, but organized violence. Not just aggression, but tactical aggression. The ability to take damage and keep fighting was built into human biology and human culture and human technology. The battle lasted 6 hours. By the end of it, the Krathok had lost 400 ships. The human fleet had lost 3 destroyers and 17 frigates. Over 2,000 humans had died. But the Krathok advance had been stopped. The remaining bioships retreated back toward the edge of Velkhari space. Amy did not pursue them yet. She needed to assess her fleet's condition and establish supply lines. She also needed to coordinate with the Velkhari government. Captain Lyran contacted her as soon as the shooting stopped. His voice was filled with awe and fear. He told her that in 3,000 years of Velkhari history, they had never seen anything like what the humans had just done. Amy's response was practical. She told him this was just the beginning. The Krathok would regroup and attack again. The humans needed to establish defensive positions and evacuate vulnerable colonies and prepare for a longer campaign. Lyran asked how long the humans could stay and what they wanted in return. Amy told him they would stay until the job was done. As for payment, she said they could work that out later. Right now, there were people who needed help, and that was all that mattered. She ended the transmission and turned to her crew. They were exhausted and bloody, and several of them were injured, but they were also smiling. For the first time in 80 years, humanity had fought for something other than themselves. They had proven they could use their strength to protect instead of destroy. Amy gave them 4 hours to rest and repair. Then they would go hunt down the rest of the Krathok swarm and finish what they started. The Krathok swarm had already invaded 3 Velkari colony worlds by the time the human fleet arrived. These planets were lost in the sense that their orbital defenses were destroyed, and their cities were under attack. Millions of Velkari civilians were trapped on the surface while Krathok warrior forms hunted them through the ruins. Captain Amy Chen studied the tactical situation and made a decision that shocked Captain Lyran. She told him the humans were going to retake the colonies. Lyran explained that this was impossible. The Velkari had already tried and failed. Their ground forces were not trained for combat against an enemy like the Krathok. Amy thanked him for the information, and then she did it anyway. The first dropships launched from the Valiant toward a colony world called Sereth Minor. Each dropship carried 40 human soldiers in full combat armor. Lieutenant Kate Morrison was in the lead ship along with her platoon. She was 29 years old, and she had joined the Marines because she wanted to see the galaxy. Instead, she had spent 8 years training for combat that everyone said would never happen. Now she was dropping onto an alien world to fight an enemy she had only read about in briefing files. She checked her weapon for the 3rd time and looked at her squad. Sergeant Paul Hughes gave her a thumbs up. The rest of the soldiers looked calm and ready. The dropships hit atmosphere at speeds that would have torn apart civilian craft. They were designed to survive surface-to-air fire and extreme conditions. The Krathok tried to shoot them down, but human point defense systems destroyed the incoming projectiles. The ships landed in the middle of what had been a Velkari city. The buildings were beautiful even in their destroyed state. Curved towers and artistic architecture now burning and broken. The ramps dropped and Kate led her platoon out into hell. The air was full of smoke and the smell of burning organic matter. Somewhere in the distance she could hear the sounds of Velkari civilians screaming. The first Krathok warrior form appeared from behind a collapsed building. It was 3 meters tall with 6 legs and 4 arms. Its body was covered in chitinous armor and its limbs ended in blade-like claws. It had been engineered by the hive mind to be a perfect killer. It saw the humans and charged without hesitation. Kate raised her rifle and fired a 3-round burst. The bullets were armor-piercing tungsten carbide, and they punched through the Krathok's chitin like it was made of paper. The creature collapsed and slid to a stop at her feet. The entire engagement took 2 seconds. Paul's voice came over the squad channel. He reported multiple contacts approaching from the north. Kate ordered her squad to form a defensive line and prepare for sustained combat. The Krathok came in a wave. Dozens of warrior forms rushing across the rubble with their claws extended. The Marines opened fire with overlapping fields of automatic weapons fire. The sound was deafening. Bullets cut through the Krathok like they were cutting grass. The creatures tried to close the distance, but they could not move faster than human reaction times. Every warrior that charged died before it got within 10 meters. Kate's platoon pushed deeper into the city. They moved in practiced formations with overlapping fields of fire and mutual support. They used grenades to clear buildings and heavy weapons to destroy hardened positions. The Krathok kept attacking in waves because the hive mind did not understand tactics the way humans did. It only understood consumption and expansion. It threw its warriors at the humans expecting to overwhelm them through numbers. But humans had spent 10,000 years fighting each other, and they had learned every lesson that war could teach. They knew how to use cover and how to concentrate fire, and how to maintain discipline under pressure. After 2 hours of combat, Kate's platoon had cleared 6 city blocks and rescued over 300 Velkari civilians. The aliens were terrified of both the Krathok and the humans. They had never seen violence like this. Kate tried to reassure them through her translator, but she knew she probably looked like a monster in her powered armor covered in Krathok blood. She detailed 2 soldiers to escort the civilians back to the dropships, and then she pushed forward again. The mission was to reach the colonial government building where several thousand Velkari were trapped. Intelligence said the Krathok had surrounded the building and were trying to break in. Kate's platoon reached the government plaza after 4 hours of continuous fighting. The building was a beautiful structure of glass and light metal. It was surrounded by hundreds of Krathok warrior forms that were tearing at the walls and trying to find a way inside. Kate contacted the other platoons and coordinated a 3-sided assault. On her signal, all 3 platoons opened fire simultaneously. The Krathok were caught in a kill zone with nowhere to run. The battle lasted 15 minutes. When it was over, the plaza was covered in dead Krathok, and not a single human had been seriously injured. The Velkari inside the building emerged slowly. They could not believe they were being rescued. They could not believe the humans had come through an army of Krathok to reach them. Kate removed her helmet so they could see her face. She told them they were safe now, and that transport was coming to evacuate them. An elderly Velkari approached her carefully. He was some kind of government official based on his clothing. He asked why the humans had come, why they had risked their lives for a species they did not know. Kate thought about the question. She could have given him a political answer or a military answer. Instead, she told him the truth. She said that humans came from a world where everything was dangerous, and survival meant helping each other. She said that when someone calls for help, you answer if you can. It was that simple. The evacuation of Sarath Minor took 3 days. Human ground forces cleared the Krathok from every major population center. They established security zones and safe corridors. They worked around the clock without complaint because that was what soldiers did. The Velkari watched in amazement as these Deathworlders showed compassion and discipline in equal measure. They had expected monsters. What they got were warriors who knew when to fight and when to protect. The operation was repeated on the other 2 invaded colonies. In each case, human forces landed in overwhelming strength and cleared the Krathok through superior tactics and firepower. The cost was not zero. 143 human soldiers died in the ground campaign. Hundreds more were wounded. But they had saved millions of Velkari lives and retaken 3 worlds that everyone had thought were lost. Back on the Valiant, Amy received the casualty reports and felt the weight of command. Every name on that list was someone she was responsible for, someone who had trusted her leadership. She read each name and made herself remember. Commander Ryan found her in her office late at night. He told her that what they had done was remarkable. They had proven that humanity could fight with honor. Amy nodded, but she did not feel victorious. She felt tired and sad and determined. The war was not over yet. The Krathok swarm was still out there and they would attack again. But now the Velkari had hope. Now they had allies who would stand with them. And now the galaxy was starting to realize that maybe humanity was not the monster they had imagined. Maybe humanity was exactly what the galaxy needed, even if they had been too afraid to admit it. Kate Morrison sat with her squad in the barracks of their transport ship. They were cleaning weapons and checking equipment and telling stories about the battle. Paul asked her if she thought this would change anything, if the galaxy would finally accept humanity. Kate shrugged and said she did not know. But she knew they had done the right thing. They had answered a call for help and they had saved lives. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was called exactly 17 hours after news of the human intervention reached the central stations. Representatives from 47 species gathered in the Grand Chamber that orbited a neutron star in neutral space. The chamber was designed to be impressive with soaring architecture and advanced holographic displays. But today the mood was not one of cooperation and unity. Today the mood was panic. Counselor Venn of the Tarthian Combine was the first to speak. His crystalline form pulsed with agitated colors as he declared that humanity had broken the quarantine. They had deployed military forces outside their designated zone. They had engaged in combat operations without authorization. This was exactly what the quarantine was designed to prevent. Other counselors joined in with their own concerns and complaints. The Zelthani representative worried that humans would now feel empowered to ignore other galactic laws. The Morphean delegate suggested increasing the quarantine restrictions and perhaps even deploying enforcement fleets to push humanity back into their system. The debate grew heated with voices overlapping and accusations flying. In the back of the chamber sat Ambassador Helen Foster. She was the human representative to the council, and she had held this position for 20 years. For most of that time, she had been ignored or dismissed. No one wanted to hear from the representative of the quarantined Deathworlders, but today everyone wanted her to explain what her species had done. Helen waited patiently for her turn to speak. She was 60 years old, and she had learned long ago that anger and frustration accomplished nothing in this chamber. When Counselor Venn finally acknowledged her, she stood and activated her holographic display. She showed footage from the Velkari colonies, the burning cities and the fleeing civilians and the Krathok warriors hunting them. She showed the distress call that the Velkari had sent, the desperate plea for help that had gone out to anyone who might answer. She asked the council a simple question. If they had received that call, what would they have done? The chamber fell silent because everyone knew the answer. They would have debated and formed committees and discussed the proper protocols. And by the time they reached a decision, the Velkari would have been extinct. Helen then showed footage from the human intervention, the fleet arriving and engaging the Krathok, the ground forces landing and rescuing civilians, the 3 invaded colonies being retaken. She showed the casualty figures: 143 humans dead, over 4 million Velkari saved. She let the numbers speak for themselves. Then she addressed the council's concerns about humanity breaking quarantine. She acknowledged that yes, her people had violated the terms of their confinement, but she asked what the alternative had been. Should they have ignored the distress call and let millions die? Should they have followed rules while an entire species faced extinction? The debate shifted after Helen's presentation. Some counselors remained adamant that humanity should be punished, but others began to question whether the quarantine had been the right decision in the first place. The Velkari had been invited to send a representative, and Captain Lyran Thoss arrived to give testimony. He stood before the assembled species and told them what he had witnessed. He described the Krathok swarm and how his people had been helpless against them. He described sending the distress call in desperation, not knowing if anyone would respond. He described watching the human fleet arrive and fight with a ferocity and courage that he could not comprehend. Lyran's voice broke with emotion as he described the ground forces landing to rescue civilians from the invaded colonies. He said that the humans had asked for nothing in return. They had not demanded payment or territory or political concessions. They had simply come because someone needed help. He looked around the chamber at all the species who had ignored the Velkari distress calls. He asked them what kind of civilization they were building if they only helped those who were convenient to help. He told them that humanity had shown more compassion and honor in 3 days than the entire Galactic Council had shown in 3 months. The council took a recess to allow members to consult with their governments. The debate continued for hours behind closed doors. The fundamental question was whether humanity's actions had been a violation that required punishment or a service that deserved recognition. 3 days later, Admiral Jacob Pierce arrived at the council station aboard a small diplomatic vessel. He had been invited to present humanity's case directly. He entered the grand chamber in his full dress uniform with his officers behind him. He stood before the assembled species and prepared to speak. He knew that what he said here would determine humanity's future in the galaxy. Jacob began by acknowledging humanity's history. He did not try to hide or excuse the wars and the violence and the terrible things his species had done. He said that yes, humans were violent and aggressive and dangerous. They came from a world that tried to kill them every day, and they had evolved to survive and fight and win. But he said that coming from a harsh world did not make them monsters. It made them survivors, and survivors understood that strength was meaningless if it was not used to protect those who were weaker. He explained what humanity had been doing during their 80 years of quarantine. They had unified their species and eliminated war among themselves. They had developed technology and built a civilization that valued both strength and compassion. They had prepared themselves not to conquer the galaxy, but to protect it. He activated a holographic display showing the battle against the Krathok. He walked the council through the tactical decisions and the strategic thinking. He explained how human forces had minimized civilian casualties while maximizing military effectiveness. He showed them the medical stations where human doctors were treating wounded Velkari. He showed them the reconstruction efforts where human engineers were helping rebuild damaged colonies. He told them that this was what humanity wanted to contribute to the galaxy. Not conquest or domination, but protection and service. He said that the galaxy had created the quarantine because they feared what humans might do. But they should have been paying attention to what humans had actually done. The vote on lifting the quarantine was not unanimous, but it passed with a significant majority. Humanity would be granted full membership in the Galactic Council, with all the rights and responsibilities that came with it. But there was one condition. Humanity would serve as the primary military force for the Council. When species faced threats they could not handle alone, humanity would be the ones to respond. Some counselors framed this as a punishment, a way to contain human aggression by directing it toward acceptable targets. But Jacob knew better. This was humanity's purpose. This was what they had been preparing for. The galaxy needed protectors, and humans were uniquely qualified for the role. The news reached Earth and the other human colonies within hours. There were celebrations in the streets and tears of joy from people who had lived their entire lives under quarantine. Humanity was finally free. They were finally accepted. But acceptance came with responsibility. Admiral Jacob returned to Luna Base 7 and immediately began reorganizing the fleet. If humanity was going to be the galaxy's military arm, then they needed to be ready for anything. Captain Amy Chen was promoted to admiral and given command. Of the First Response Fleet, Lieutenant Kate Morrison received a medal for valor and was offered a position training other species in ground combat tactics. The Velkari sent a formal message of gratitude to Earth. It was broadcast across all human channels, and it was simple, but profound. Thank you for answering our call. Thank you for proving that strength and compassion are not opposites. Thank you for showing us what humanity really is. The message was signed by Captain Lyran Thos and millions of Velkari citizens. Amy read it in her quarters aboard the Valiant. She thought about the soldiers who had died in the fighting. She thought about the Velkari they had saved. She thought about the future that was opening up for her species. Then she filed the message away and returned to work. There would be other distress calls, other species in need, other battles to fight, and humanity would answer every single one because that was what humans did. They survived and they protected and they never abandoned those who called for help. The age of isolation was over. The age of service had begun, and the galaxy would learn that the Deathworlders they had feared were actually the guardians they had always needed.